Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for filling out those polls that we have available to you. So it looks like we have a fairly good distribution of people who have a little practical experience with resilience measurement, but then we also have people in the room who are familiar with the concept but aren't but have no practical experience. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to discuss these issues in more detail, and I think we'll have something for everyone in this presentation. I'm also very pleased to see that the majority of you have read some or all of the guidance notes, which is fantastic. And I think this is, an opportunity for us to explore those issues further. And I think it's an opportunity for you all to pose questions that you may have had while you were reading those guidance notes. So I'm going to talk about shock and capacity measurements. And the three things I want you to know about measuring shocks is that it's fundamental to resilience analysis. And what I mean by that is we cannot really talk about resilience or analyze resilience if we can't have a measure of what we're talking about resilience to. In other words, we need to have some sort of shock to index our outcomes to. And Tim will talk a little bit more about that in his section. The second point I want you to take away is while this might be new to us, there has been a lot of work in other disciplines that has gone into developing indicators and measures of different shocks. And in fact, many databases are already online. So there's a huge opportunity for us to apply these existing measures in new and innovative ways and for kind of cross-discipline learning. Finally, the third point is that every shock is different, both in its nature and also its experienced differently. And this is kind of due to differential vulnerabilities across households. And so I will get into this further, but suffice to say for now, this really means that we need a variety of indicators that measure the shock severity and duration. A quick note on the data sources that are available to us. So some of them are old, and as I mentioned before, some of them are newer and we're not less familiar with them. So we have our traditional data sources at the individual and household level. So this is quantitative surveys, key informant interviews, FGDs. But then we also have some data sources of various shocks that may be less familiar to us. So this is, for example, the African Flood and Drought Monitor, which provides kind of precipitation data and other kind of flood and drought related measures for the African continent. We also have the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED. So there's a whole gamut of resources available to us that we should be pulling into our analysis as secondary data. So to my third point above, on the complexity of any given shock. I usually use drought as an example, so this time I'm going to use floods, but I'd like to group in kind of 1 to 3 or 5 words, describe what you see in this picture, right? So we can see there's a swollen river, a flooded river. We see some erosion. We see a landslide. We see houses next to a river, so there may have been some property damage or lives lost. We see food production next to the river, or crop production, that is.
Of the bank along the farming side of the river, it looks like there could have been a road or a pathway there that would have been washed out. And so that could have potentially devastating impacts in the short term in terms of access to markets, access to health centers, access to education. And so the main point here is some households, perhaps the ones that are located further away from the river, maybe they don't have any agricultural production, they may not be directly affected by this flood, whereas other households might be really, really severely affected. And so the main point is we need to have measures, not only objective measures of what's happening to the river itself, but also what's happening at the household level. So for this particular event, there could be dozens of indicators that we use. So we could, like I mentioned before, we could use those objective indicators, but we can also measure lives lost. We can also measure property destroyed, income loss, the psychological impacts of the floods. So basically, we need to have many different measures of a particular shock to understand both the objective experience and the subjective experience. So in sum, objective measures are great, but they really only tell part of the story. Usually they kind of tell us more about what shocks people have been exposed to, but we also need to understand subjective household experiences. Finally, the metrics need to take into account variation over scale. And what I mean by that is whether or not it's idiosyncratic or covariate. And what I mean by those terms, for those of you who've read the guidance notes, you'll know idiosyncratic means that it's generally affecting a single household or a small group of households. So these are things like death of a family member, illness, or it could be covariate. And these are the kind of larger shocks that affect a large number of people. So this could be flooding, droughts, conflict, etc. But then there's also a time dimension to this as well. And so whether or not it's something that happens is rapid onset and very quick, or whether it's something that happens like over a long period of time like drought. And so not only do we need different objective and subjective measures, but we also need measures that cover these different scales. So at the household level versus the community level, as well as time. So in the aftermath of a shock and kind of repeated measurement over time. And so this is why we often say we need panel data for resilience analysis. I'm going to shift quickly to measuring capacities. So resilience capacities, like shocks, they require a fair amount of consideration in advance of what capacities exist in a particular context. They're very complicated, and they're often interrelated and operate at multiple levels. Like I said before, this implies that this requires different diverse metrics and data sources measured over time. But the good news is you're probably already measuring resilience capacities, but you may not be viewing them through a resilience lens. And what I mean by that is we may not be thinking about how this particular capacity that you're measuring is related to a given response that you would like to see in response to a shock. So we often think of resilience capacities in terms of absorptive, adaptive, and transformative. So absorptive capacities kind of is the ability to minimize exposure and sensitivity to shocks and stresses through kind of preventative measures, and so in appropriate coping strategies. So like disaster risk reduction, access to financial services, health insurance, savings, things like this. Adaptive resilience capacities are the ability to make informed choices and changes in livelihood or other strategies in response to kind of the long-term changes that you're observing in a particular context. So this could be livelihood diversification, this could be various social capitals, access and use of information, and ability to adapt how your strategies. Finally, the transformative capacities are really kind of, we think of these as the operational environment and what are the enablers and what are the barriers to households kind of realizing their agency. And so these could be policies and regulations, gender norms, networks, etc. What's really important here is like these are helpful kind of organizational tools, but often, sometimes you can find yourself in a bit of a tying yourself in knots trying to figure out, well, is it absorptive or adaptive? And maybe it's absorptive at one time and adaptive at another time. I think these are helpful to understand capacities, but I wouldn't worry about getting too lost in the weeds of trying to categorize each individual capacity. So I want to spend a bit of time here on this slide with the couple of minutes I have remaining. But basically, there's a lot that goes into identifying what are the resilience capacities that are context relevant. And ideally, this is done through a resilience assessment process. And so this is the first webinar of the series that covered the first guidance notes of this practical guidance series. And so I do encourage you all to read that guidance note if you haven't already, because that sets the foundation for identifying what are the important capacities, what are the important shocks, what are the important well-being outcomes that we're interested in. And so what we need to do is, what we can do first is think about what are the important responses. Like how would we like to see households respond in the context of a shock or a stress? And so we kind of think of them in three functions of preventing or reducing exposure to a shock or a stress. So this could be like prophylactic measures like annual health checks. It could be evacuation or relocation. Responses that are done in preparation for a shock or a stress. This is investing in new livelihoods or inputs or disaster preparedness activities. And then actions when a shock or a stress occurs. So how, coping strategies they're using, use of credit, asset sales. When you think about how households are responding, then you can start to think, okay, if I want to see this particular response, what are the kinds of things that households and people need to elicit, to give that response in the context of a shock or a stress? And so then when you start to do that, you can build it out into a theory of change. And so this is, we tend to think about, we have our program activities on the left. Some of the outputs of those activities would be a particular capacity is strengthened. So this could be access to credit, it could be technical knowledge, it could be productive assets owned, or other kind of capacities built. And then in response to a shock, we can see whether or not people are actually giving this particular response. Finally, I want to quickly wrap up. This is super important. This is an example of an M&E framework from the PRIME project in Ethiopia. And basically, the main point is we need to collect varied indicators at different time and spatial scales, depending on what are the capacities we want to measure. And finally, we should, like with shocks, we need these objective and subjective measures collected over time. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim to try and keep on time here.
All right, I hope everybody can hear me. So I'm going to be talking about resilience analysis. Thanks for that presentation, Brad. It was a nice lead in. So there are several things that we're interested in. When you are doing analysis of resilience as part of your resilience work, we want to make sure that we define our objectives very clearly. What are we trying to actually accomplish in our analysis? Also, it's very important to understand what are the most appropriate analytical approaches for doing that analysis. And then finally, how do we interpret and synthesize the data in a way that helps inform programming going forward? So one of the three key takeaways I'm hoping that you have from this presentation is that how important it is to lay out your purpose and objectives of the research. Without this, it's almost impossible to effectively conduct the research or the study. So be clear about what your research objectives are as part of your analysis. The second point I want to drive home is that mixed methods are invaluable for this resilience analysis. The fact that you combine both quantitative and qualitative techniques is essential so that the qualitative helps interpret the quantitative and allows you to better understand what's actually going on in terms of resilience in an area. Finally, at a minimum, you need to make sure that we're collecting information on shocks and stresses, on these capacities that Brad just talked about, and well-being outcomes that are fundamental to any resilience analysis. So we're looking at the relationships between these things. That's really important as part of our analysis, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so one of the things that's really important about resilience analysis is we're moving away from thresholds or point estimates to looking at relationships between variables. We're particularly interested in how shocks, stresses, and the risks associated with that are affecting people's well-being, how the capacities that people are engaging in actually mediate those shocks and stresses. And we want to look at those relationships over time. So if people are well adapted to the shocks in the short term, does that continue over the longer term? Because people aren't really resilient if they deplete all of their capacities or all of their resources within a year or two, then their ability to manage that next set of shocks goes down dramatically. So again, just to re-emphasize, we're looking at these shocks and stresses, both objectively and subjectively, in relationship to these capacities and how these capacities help influence or reduce the effect of these shocks and stresses on these well-being development outcomes. So the other thing as part of our analysis is that we try to construct indices to simplify complex, multifaceted concepts. So as Brad was talking about, we have these absorptive capacities, adaptive capacities, and transformative capacities that are actually constructed as indices to see how these affect people's ability to manage shocks and stresses. But we have to pull these indices apart and look at the individual components if we really want to know where we need to put our investments to improve resilience in a particular area. So we use a combination of techniques for constructing and analyzing the indices, but also for allowing us to do the individual focus on the individual components. So in terms of dynamics, our analysis also tries to not only look at the relationships between these variables over time, we want to make sure that we're tracking the same households over time so that we can control for quite a bit of the variance and see if it really is these capacities that are making a difference. And we want to be able to see in real time how people are actually managing these shocks. So as the shocks are unfolding and the downstream effects of those shocks, we actually can see whether or not people are managing or not managing over time. So when we're defining our purpose and our objectives, we have two broad purposes in resilience analysis. One is that we want to understand the resilience dynamics in a specific context so that we can set our investment and programming strategies. And two, we want to identify which interventions are more likely to be building resilience. This is really important that we capture this because if the resilience analysis is not helping us to do better programming, then it's not worth the money that we're actually investing in it. So there's three categories of research objectives that apply to this research purpose. One, we want to understand the existing resilience levels that people are exhibiting. So we know that there's a lot of variance out there with regards to some households have greater capacity to manage shocks and stresses. Other households have less capacity. We want to understand how these dynamics change over time. So are people getting exposed to more and more shocks? Are they being able to manage those shocks over time? Are they reducing the number of capacities to deal with those shocks because they're eroding? Are they coping with those shocks, or are they turning to more negative coping strategies? So we're really trying to explore these relationships as we move on. So determining existing levels, we want to, from our descriptive analysis, we want to understand what resilience capacities, what are the levels that currently exist, what kinds of coping strategies are people actually implementing, what is their current shock exposure, and what are their current well-being outcomes, so that we kind of get an understanding and current status in that particular context. But we have to look at trends over time to really understand the dynamic nature of resilience. So we want to know whether or not these households and communities are stable, or they're in very volatile situations. Are they growing in relationship to their building of capacity, or are they declining in relationships to that? So what's happening in terms of these capacities, to these shocks, to these coping strategies, and these well-being outcomes over time? Okay. So to understand these trends, we have three types of research questions we're trying to examine. One is, how are the levels of resilience capacities changing over time? In other words, are people building these up through project interventions, or are they eroding as they respond to these shocks? How is shock exposure evolving over time? So one of the things that always happens when a drought or flood hits is that there are a lot of downstream effects associated with those shocks. So a drought may hit, then people will try to sell their animals because they need to buy more food because their crops have failed. Everybody's trying to sell their animals at the same time, so there's prices go up in the market, so you've got a market shock that's starting to hit. People start migrating to other areas that for pasture and water, and they get into conflict with other ethnic groups. So we're interested in how these shocks exposure changes over time, and whether or not well-being is maintained over time as well. One of our best indicators of resilience is that we have stability in regards to a well-being in the face of these shocks and stresses. So if we're seeing over time that people's food security is not getting worse, or even getting better, then that's a good thing. That means that people are pretty resilient to these particular shocks and stresses. Some other common research objectives that we're trying to capture through our resilience analysis is, what is the relationship between shocks and household well-being? In other words, do these shocks have a negative effect on well-being? Do the resilience capacities that we're measuring, are they associated with maintaining improvements in its well-being outcomes? In other words, these capacities are having a mitigating effect. And then which capacities serve to reduce the negative effects of shocks on household well-being? So we want to know so that we can make our investments more value for money if we're investing in things that really make a difference. Other important research questions. We want to know, for example, which resilience capacities are associated with using positive coping strategies and preventing the use of negative coping strategies. So what we found in some of our recurrent monitoring work that we were doing in Ethiopia was that some of the capacities that people had prevented them from turning to negative coping strategies, like pulling their children out of school or cutting back on the foods that they were eating, or turning to negative strategies like getting into debt to manage the shocks. So we want to know, how do we make sure that people aren't turning to these negative coping strategies that have long-term negative effects on households' recovery. We also want to know something about the relationship between households and community resilience. In other words, if a community is resilient, does that also mean that all the households in that community are resilient? And vice versa. If we have a number of households that are resilient in an area, does that mean the community itself is resilient? And so we're trying to look at this relationship between these different levels. We also, as I said before, are interested in the interventions that serve to build household resilience capacities. So again, trying to inform programming going forward. So to do these estimation models that are an important part of our measurement, we need to know what kinds of analysis are required and the indicators that are needed. So if we are clear on the definition of our objectives and the research questions, we can start to develop formal estimation models that explicitly detail which relationships that we're of interest in and that we're going to be analyzing. So some of the research questions that help us put these estimation models together are, we want to know what are the outcomes of interest. Is it food security? Is it poverty? Is it health? what resilience capacities are of interest. We want to look at both the objective capacities that are easy to measure, as well as the more subjective psychosocial characteristics of households. And then what are the main shocks that we need to factor in to our estimation model? So one of the things that is really key to doing good analysis is related to the measurement. So do we have the ability to respond to questions effectively and rigorously? In other words, are the households themselves understanding our questions, and is it easy for us to analyze the results of those questions? What are the data requirements for that purpose? And do we have the finances, the time, and the personnel to actually do this analysis? A lot of times, a lot of the implementing agencies do not have the people with the skills that might be necessary to do this, or we don't have the money to do a rigorous impact evaluation. All of these things have to be factored into account when we're trying to do these types of analyses. As I said before, mixed methods are critical to this work. So we're doing both descriptive and trends analyses with data, but we're also using regression analyses and factor analyses to construct our indices. Qualitative type of work that we're collecting, in addition to focus group and key informant interviews, we're very interested in positive deviant analysis. In other words, what individual households are actually doing okay in managing the shocks and stresses, and what are the characteristics of those households that are important. Life history also allows us to determine why is it that some households backslide into poverty and others don't. What is it about their history that allowed them to maintain their resilience in the face of these shocks and stresses? And then finally, because social capital is so important in managing shocks and stresses, we want to do social network analysis to see how people are connected and what kinds of factors influence those connections. So some illustrative quantitative analysis approaches. So we use descriptive statistics that are simply averages or percentages so that allow us to understand how many households are below the poverty line, what is the household size, the per capita income, etc. We use trend analysis as an effective tool to describe how factors vary over time. So are people getting poorer over time? Is their food security getting worse over time? Are the shock exposure getting worse over time? So these trends analyses is merely reporting the same descriptive statistics over time. We also use regression analysis as a way to estimate the relationship between a dependent variable and one or more independent variables. So it enables us to do causal interpretation. We must have an experimental or quasi-experimental research design, or use special regression techniques for this purpose. So to give you an example of what we're talking about, we did an analysis in Bangladesh looking at the Bangladesh floods of 2014. And what we were interested in was, did the resilience capacities that people had actually enable them to maintain their food security in the face of that flood? And which capacities were the most important? We used our factor analysis as a way to construct the resilience capacities indices that we were looking at. What we found was that these resilience capacities did make a difference in allowing people to have increased number of months of adequate food, and it also reduced the likelihood that households would experience hunger. The strongest evidence of these capacities that increased resilience to shocks were the bonding and bridging social capital, people's access to services, their exposure to information, particularly early warning information, women's empowerment, which was a very important factor in allowing people to be more resilient to these shocks and stresses, the governance systems that existed at the village level, and the informal safety nets. All of these were critical capacities that made a difference in enabling people to manage these floods. Just to reiterate, the three key qualitative things that we want you to take away is that the positive deviance analysis is really important for really trying to understand why are some households better able to manage these shocks and stresses than others, so that we can learn from those households in our programming. Second, these life history analyses are really important for helping us to be able to understand why some households are able to escape from poverty while others are not. And then finally, the social network analysis allows us to look at these patterns, connections, the strengths of those connections, and proximity over the various relationships that individuals, households, communities, and governments may have, and why these networks are important for enabling people to not only share information, but share resources so that they can manage shocks more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, this is Karen Fox. I'm with TANGO International, a senior research advisor with a focus on livelihoods and resilience. First, I just really want to thank you both, Brad and Tim, for offering some really clear presentations covering a lot of material with 3 guidance notes in such a short period of time. I'm happy to be able to moderate some group work as well as a Q&A session. We have a number of participants from all over the world representing a real range of diverse contexts. And it's important, we really want to hear from you. And so we've allocated a good amount of time during this webinar for some small group discussions and then just general plenary Q&A. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and explain what we'll be doing with the breakout groups. We'll have 4 different rooms. And as you logged in this morning, you were assigned to one of those 4 groups. Each group will have its own dedicated moderator. We have Tim, Brad, and also Tiffany. Thank you as well for your opening remarks this morning. And then I'll also be helping to moderate one of those groups. So each group will have about 7 or 8 minutes to chat amongst yourselves in a dedicated group chat box. During that time, the sound will be completely muted. So it will sound like no one is here, but keep the chat going online. We'll be paying attention. At the end of our small group work, each of the moderators for the group will report out on some of the main themes, issues, questions that you bring up during your group work. And that will also feed us directly into our Q&A. So thank you as well for the questions that you posed during participant registration, as well as throughout the session. Keep them coming. We're tracking those. And after we finish the breakout group readout, we will jump right into questions, answers, and discussion. So again, we do want to hear from you. It certainly informs an ongoing refinement of these guidance notes, as well as the other products that the Real Award is developing. So with that, we will go ahead and turn into the breakout groups. We will all be discussing a single question today. That question is, what are some of the challenges that you have faced, or some of the outstanding questions that you have about doing resilience, measurement, and analysis? For example, is that focused on shock measurement, on analyzing capacities? What are some of the main constraints that you or your organizations face? We've also noted sampling as an issue that comes up. So again, this is our time to discuss in group, and we'll come back together in about 7 or 8 minutes. Any questions? Please do communicate that with us via chat, and we will get back to you. Thank you.
This is Karen back again. We let those breakout groups run just a minute or 2 longer than expected because we had so much great feedback. So thank you all for engaging. And again, Maya, at the close of the session, will come back to how we can carry this conversation onward for those questions that we're not able to address today, or issues and examples that you've raised, and some of the cross-learning that we have within and across our groups. So if we can go ahead and start with breakout group number 1, moderated by Tiffany. No, Brad. Oh, Brad. Sorry, take that back. Group 1. moderated by Brad.
I can go ahead and give a quick summary. We had a really lively discussion on this. It was fantastic. We had a few comments on setting up M&E systems and systems to track these over time. And then this also includes like what variables to include. We also had a few discussions about how to measure at different scales, and this included, this was also related to kind of sampling, and one respondent per household may not be enough if we want to talk about intra-household issues. And then we also talked about different types of resilience, and so we often think about food, our outcomes are often related to food security, but should we also include other kind of health and other economic indicators of resilience? I'm going to pause there and so we can get through all the groups.
Thank you, Brad. This is Karen with group number 2. And again, lots of great input. One of the main issues that was raised initially are some of the ethical questions or challenges around conducting a survey in the face of a shock. So I think we can definitely dive into that during our Q&A. Like what does counterfactual mean in practical and ethical terms when we're doing resilience analysis? Someone also raised a point about how heavy the primary data collection requirements can be and how that often presents an obstacle. So we'd like to talk more about approaches that people are using, lighter touch methods, including leveraging secondary and administrative data. Another interesting question, getting back to your point, Brad, about scale. What does it mean in practical terms to shift our data collection from the individual and the household level to the community level and then onward to that transformative or institutional level, particularly when we're talking about covariate shocks? And I think another key point that relates to all of our M&E work has to do with that capacity and skill set and the difference between an M&E role and a research role and how that relates to a resilience analysis. And finally, what are some of the new technologies that people are using to collect data that's relevant for resilience analysis? Drone, satellite imagery, and we had a response from John Kurtz at Mercy Corps that in fact they are piloting the use of drones, no pun intended, so just had to share that. So that's what we have in a summary for group number 2. I will pass it over to Tiffany if you could share out for group number 3, please.
Yeah, our group also had a really great discussion, so thank you to everyone in group 3 for participating. Some of the questions and challenges that bubbled up, what do you do when you don't have panel data? So how can you leverage cross-sectional data in a resilience analysis? What are the similarities and differences between research questions that are resilience related versus non-resilience related? There were some technical questions around creating or constructing your resilience capacity indices and thresholds, kind of how stable does a household or community have to be before they're actually considered resilient. There were some questions around time horizons, kind of slow versus rapid onset shocks and stresses. And then some of the challenges that emerged are how do you apply resilience measurement principles, which are kind of inherently broad in nature, to projects that are more narrow in scope? How do you capture idiosyncratic and covariate shocks and stresses? How do you manage selection bias or sampling biases in different communities? So yeah, why don't I stop there, and then hopefully we can get into these during the Q&A section.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yeah, a lot of good questions that we will try to come back to in the last half an hour we have together. So that, Tim, can you please share with us some of the insights from group number 4?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. You know, our group had some very interesting discussions. One is that kind of taking a systems perspective, one of our participants was talking about how they try to analyze things from a systems perspective and how the systems themselves are changing in the face of shocks and stresses, and why it's important for the system to be able to make those changes for itself rather than being forced to from outside. That's part of our resilience thinking. Another one was the importance of participatory, locally defined measures to help us understand these things, and how much do we actually spend with the actual communities themselves trying to understand from their perspective what are the key points around resilience that we should be trying to capture. Another interesting debate that I think, or idea that was thrown about was, how does adaptive capacity actually prevent people from, or inhibit people from transforming themselves to better adapt to future shocks and stresses? So what is the relationship between transformative changes and adaptive capacity and vice versa? And can certain transformative capacities prevent people from actually being more adaptive? So, you know, if you have harsh policies that squash dissent, it might make peace, that might create peace, but it further entrenches structural forms of violence towards people. So, interesting dynamic between transformative capacity and adaptive capacity that I think needs to be fleshed out more as we go forward in the resilience measurement.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to everyone for participating and providing these really useful insights and key questions. We have until 11:25 DC time, so that's another 25 minutes to try to discuss and address some of these issues. So I'd like to ask Brad and Tim, along with Tiffany, to keep your mics ready to go on and off. We'll, again, direct these questions. I recognize that you can respond to each of these questions, so we'll toggle back and forth, and please feel free to fill in some gaps. A lot of these questions definitely get to what is unique about resilience analysis, and that's that dynamic and complex, very nuanced, multi-scalar, multi-level type of analysis that raises some challenges that we face in conventional M&E, but also more acutely in resilience analysis. So, Tim, I'd like to go ahead and start with the first question, I guess the last point that you raised from your group as a way to sort of kick off our discussion, because it brings us right back to the deeper understanding of resilience capacities and the relationship between those. So if you could just discuss a bit what you see about the interplay between absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities. And it ties in as well to another key question we have about time frames. How can you design a research or an M&E system that can address short-term and these longer-term transformative aspects of resilience analysis?
Right. Okay. So, I don't think there are any easy answers to these questions. I think each context is going to present its own unique challenges in trying to unravel these things. But I think we have seen examples where we've seen changes in, and these are positive changes in policies or positive changes in infrastructure or positive changes in social norms that have created more opportunities for people to strengthen their adaptive capacities. Now, we recognize that transformative capacity takes a long time and often can't be achieved in a 5-year time frame. So we often talk about a 10 to 15-year focus around transformative capacities, even though we can only implement programs for maybe 5 to 7 years at the longest. You would have a strategy that you would be implementing in an area that would address these transformative changes over time, hoping that you build on the successes that are happening earlier and moving forward into the future. But I do think there was an interesting perspective that if some of the policies that get put in place actually constrain people's livelihoods, constrain their ability to adapt better, I think that's important for us to be looking at. And at the same time, I think if people's adaptive capacity, because people are very innovative and they keep trying to manage in a particular agroecological zone that maybe over time isn't going to work over a 20-year time frame. Maybe the adaptive capacity is preventing them from transforming. I think that's an interesting question that we also need to examine through research. I think one of the other things I wanted to talk about here was James asked about when people are responding to shocks and stresses, is there an ideal equilibrium point? If households are food insecure prior to the shocks and stresses and they bounce back to that same level, does that make them resilient or not resilient? This is an interesting question that the technical working group on resilience measurement actually tried to take on. One of the concerns we had was that we know that a lot of the vulnerable populations that we work with in a number of these areas are trying to manage these shocks and stresses that they're exposed to. And what we came down to was that there wasn't a threshold that said, okay, if you're food insecure below this threshold, you're no longer resilient, and above this threshold, you're resilient. What we were interested in, are they moving in the right direction in terms of a positive trend? And so we wanted to still say that people are becoming more resilient over time, even though they hadn't reached that ideal position of being totally food secure or out of poverty. And that's why we also are looking very carefully at this backsliding with the Center for Resilience, trying to understand what factors lead to households backsliding into poverty or backsliding into food insecurity, and what factors prevent them from backsliding. And so we are trying to understand this threshold issue, but I don't want us to just say, all right, there's no resilience there if people aren't moving in the right direction, even though they still may be some food insecurity in that area. I think we need to be open to both, but we're working towards the long-term development objectives. Stop there and open it up for anybody else.
Thanks, Tim. No, really important questions to get into. And with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Tiffany to comment in particular on that last question about equilibrium points and thresholds.
Yeah, thanks, James, so much for this question. It's one that we get quite a bit, so I just wanted to add a little bit to what Tim said. And again, I'm speaking specifically from the USAID perspective, where we, grappled with the definition of resilience for a really long time, and we're careful to make sure that our definition didn't just focus on recovery. So while recovery is one component of resilience, managing risk, mitigating risk are also equally important components. So I would just stress that households rebounding or rebounding quickly from some state post the shock doesn't fully encompass our conceptualization of resilience. The other thing that we grappled with for quite some time is whether or not to include the last kind of phrase in our definition, which is facilitating inclusive growth. So again, it's not enough just to recover, but like Tim said, over time, we want to see households having this upward trajectory with respect to development outcomes that we all care about. Now, the important part of what I just said is over time, right? And so that gets into some of these time horizon questions that have also emerged in this conversation. And all of us, particularly on the donor side, being vigilant at managing our expectations of what types of change we can see over what time horizons, particularly when we're working with some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. So within the short term, maybe, recovering to a state, even though that state is a low state of well-being, is actually a win. Or, as Tim mentioned earlier in his presentation, having stability in and around an outcome, even if that isn't a high-level outcome, even if it isn't a very positive state, but having stability in the face of the shock is actually the win. But we wouldn't want that to be the definition of progress or success over the long term. And just the last thing I'd say on that is it depends on the event and the severity of that event. So we've talked about some examples from Prime, a project in Ethiopia, where the communities were managing a 50-year drought. So with an event that severe, again, our conceptualization of progress being stability of food security, even though those food security levels were relatively low, we felt like it was progress to see stability, particularly when you see other households' food security outcomes plummeting in the face of the same event. So all of that to say is it's complicated and complex and depends on a number of different factors, and so we wouldn't want to just say, you know, a household hunger score of X or a poverty level of Y, because it doesn't take into account the complexity and just the way that these dynamics play out over time.
Thank you, Tiffany. Really good questions and good points to raise around resilience analysis. I want to get into a couple of questions that have come up specifically around how to make resilience measurements more experimental, so the use of control groups. And this ties into the question you raised as well, Christophe, around sort of the ethics and, you know, as well the practical implications for trying to do post-shock analysis and assessments. Brad, I'd like to send this your way, if you could comment.
Thanks, Karen. Yes, and so this is another question that I think we get fairly regularly in terms of how do we estimate the counterfactual for our resilience building projects. And there's a number of issues that make this particularly complicated and sticky, even beyond the ethical implications, which I'll get to. But you know, first of all, like we have mentioned, you know, we need to have some sort of shock to index against, and by definition, it's hard to predict where those particular shocks will happen. Now, that being said, there are some contexts, like Ethiopia, for example, where we can be, you know, reasonably certain that in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a severe drought. However, you know, again, we don't know exactly how severe that drought will be and which particular location, and so it's very difficult to know at fancy where it's going to happen, and so doing, you know, some sort of randomization is difficult. The second point I want to make is we're also talking about, in some cases, we're talking about systems level change, and being able to rigorously evaluate that through an impact evaluation is historically and continues to be very difficult to do. Now, all of that being said, I will say that there are examples where we have been able to do this, and I'll give 2 examples. One is an experiment that I know of that's going on in India that's looking at the, it's a randomized control trial looking at the distribution of microinsurance to small businesses in flood-prone areas, flood and cyclone-prone areas. Now, there is every possibility that that experiment will fail if they don't actually observe a flood. And so there's some degree of risk in doing these things. And it's also a very, you know, RCTs are great, but they have very kind of limited, you know, it's a very targeted intervention. And so it doesn't tell us the full gamut of information we would want to know about resilience dynamics in that context. The second example I'll give is a study I did in Ethiopia, which was looking at after a drought, we used quasi-experimental methods to see how our beneficiaries were doing relative to a synthesized control group. And so in that case, there are some methodological options that we have that we can use to estimate the counterfactual, but usually we're going to rely on quasi-experimental designs for that. I'll hand it back to Karen.
Thank you, Brad. We have some other interesting questions specific to the need and the use, the application of panel data, useful ways to analyze these types of resilience questions using cross-sectional data, or what are some of the different types of approaches, such as the recurrent monitoring survey approach that we can integrate into our resilience research. Tim, I'll send that one to you, please.
Thanks, Karen. One of the reasons why we prefer to use panel data is that it allows us to control a lot of the factors that could explain why there are variance or differences between households in the way that they respond. By looking at the same households in the baseline, the midterm, and the end line, we actually can see how these households are managing these shocks and stresses and what capacities, what's happening to the different kinds of capacities they rely on to manage the shocks and stresses, whether or not these capacities are being strengthened by the program or not. And to get back to what Brad was also talking about, one of the things that we try to do, it's very difficult to have a true control group in a lot of these impact evaluations. So the counterfactual that we normally use is villages that are receiving less of the project interventions versus those that receive more of the project interventions, so that we can compare whether intensity of interventions makes a difference in building resilience in these areas. One of the reasons why we do recurrent monitoring surveys is that it allows us to actually see what happens over a full year when households are actually trying to manage a particular shock and its downstream effects. So if, for example, as Tiffany was pointing out, a 50-year drought happens, we can actually go back and interview households with a very light instrument that only takes about 20 minutes, plus doing some qualitative focus group and key informant discussions in a subset of the villages. We can track every 2 months what is actually happening to these households over time. And what's really great about this is that it actually allows you to see some of these trends with regards to whether or not people are getting more exposed to these different shocks and stresses, how they're coping with those shocks and stresses, whether or not their food security is getting worse over time, or they're maintaining it over time. It allows us to identify these positive deviants that seem to be doing well, and allows us to then try to understand what they're doing differently that's allowing them to manage these shocks and stresses more effectively. All of this feeds into helping to do adaptive management with regards to the program. So if we see that certain capacities are really making a difference in allowing people to manage shocks and stresses and maintain their well-being outcomes, we would want the project to know that those are the things that should be looked at more carefully in strengthening over time. So it allows us to get more focused on which interventions are more value for money, and allows us to really understand how we can build resilience more effectively. So these RMSs we're collecting data every 2 months from a panel of households from the baseline that allows us to not have to recollect all of this information that you collect in a baseline, which can be a quite lengthy questionnaire. You've got all of the household characteristics, you've got their current levels of capacities, you've got their various other access to resources and stuff. You don't have to recollect that. You can just see how they're actually responding to these shocks and stresses over time and what effect it's actually having on their food security. What we also do, though, is we track some of those capacity changes over time as well. So we're interested in some particular ones that
It appears as though we've lost Tim's audio. He just dropped off. And with that, Brad, I was actually going to ask you if you could follow on to Tim's point. I think he was just about to raise some examples. So
yeah,
if you'd like to...
Yeah, absolutely. I'll follow up here. And
with that.
two
and also
things. One, oops, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, no, go ahead. I think it also ties into another question about what do we do if we only have cross-sectional data. So thank you, Brad.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to add here. The kind of examples that Tim was walking us through, I think, are kind of like are basically like the best version or the ideal version of how we can do resilience measurement, and that we understand that it's a complex and dynamic concept that changes over time. So we need to have this longitudinal data. And in all, we should strive for that wherever possible. But we also recognize that, there's always budget, time, and personnel constraints. And so one solution to that might be using secondary data. In many of these countries, there are kind of panel data sets through LSMS or other household income and expenditure surveys. Increasingly, and this actually responds to Elizabeth Dunn's question here of collecting longitudinal data to simply observe behavior over time without necessarily evaluating interventions. And so you can leverage secondary data and analyze secondary data to understand trends over time, and increasingly we see these data sets available. Second is the point on if we only have a cross-section of data. And so I would say, I guess I'm going to frame this two ways. One, in the context of post-shock, we can use a single snapshot in time to look at how households are responding and what the immediate effects of the shock are. But we really miss that bigger picture of how those might be changing over time, and if we don't have a baseline before the shock, then we can't say like how is that relative to what their normal might be. And I will hand it back to Karen.
Thanks, Brad. And Tim, it looks like we have you back online. We have so many good questions. I'd like to go ahead and jump into a question around how to develop more of a research agenda that's focused on resilience questions, and what are the distinct aspects of or differences between a resilience question and what you might consider a more typical a typical question for livelihoods or food security type initiative. Along with that, how do we set these thresholds for understanding when that household is resilient as part of our research program? So that's one part of the question that I'd like to send first to Tim, and then Brad, perhaps to follow up on that. Because in addition to how that research initiative is framed, we've got some questions around how then, and Brad, you touched on this, but how then you're actually using that secondary or administrative data to fill in gaps, to use that lighter touch, to collect information in a dynamic, real-time way. So if you could give us maybe an example of that. So first to you, Tim, if you're back online, and then if we could follow up with Brad. Thank you.
Well, I'm not quite sure I totally understand the question, but I can talk a little bit about why it's important in any of these types of studies that we do to have a well thought out protocol where you are not only being very clear about the research questions that you're trying to answer, but how you're going to answer them with the different types of data and the types of analysis that you will do. And that is through consensus building. We have a number of different stakeholders that are involved in reviewing those protocols. So we want to make sure that everybody is on board so that when we go into the actual study, we are clear about how we're actually going to answer those questions that have been raised by all of the different stakeholders. So Karen, can you tell me the second part of that question so that I can make sure I'm answering it?
Sure, Tim. And again, if you want to comment, and then we can punt to Brad. Essentially, as well as defining research questions that are somewhat different for a resilience context, how are you using effectively secondary data or administrative data as part of the overall research approach to answer resilience questions?
So one of the things about what's different about these research questions is that they tend to be very much related to the shocks and the shock dynamics and the kinds of capacities that people use to manage those shocks and stresses in relationship to some well-being outcome. So we really, they're different in the sense that they're looking at these shocks and stresses and how people manage these shocks and stresses. That's what makes them different from a lot of other type research questions. The second thing is we try very hard to stress that it's very expensive to collect primary data, and we don't recommend that you always do that if you've got good access to secondary data that's being collected in an area. So we've been able to utilize existing data that has been gathered through these income expenditure surveys that the government may be doing or the World Bank may be doing that have been collected over time so that we can analyze that data looking at it with a resilience lens. You can take existing like Food for Peace projects that are being implemented. They have very elaborate data collection going on associated with those projects. And you can use a resilience lens to reanalyze that data so that you can try to understand what's actually going on in relationship to these households managing shocks and stresses. And that's exactly what we did with the Shahardo project with CARE in Bangladesh. That was not originally set up as a resilience measurement project, but we were able to use a resilience lens to actually do that at a later date after we'd already done the data collection. We've been doing something similar in Zimbabwe using the back data there that has been collected by the Zimbabwe folks. So there are a number of different data in Malawi. Similar work has been done with the kinds of income expenditure surveys that have been done there. So I think there's real opportunity to take existing data sets and reanalyze them using a resilience lens that can tell you quite a bit about what's going on in these countries and what you should be focusing on. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tim, and also for providing some really useful, tangible examples of that. Brad, if you'd like to add on that, and then just touch really briefly on this important question we have around composite indicators. We're almost at time, and we have one additional question that I'd like to sneak in before we close our session today. Brad?
Sure, I'll be quick here. I mean, Tim hit all the major points. The only thing I would add is we can also kind of integrate secondary data from, like I was mentioning, the shock measure databases. So that's, you know, another source of secondary data that we can use. And as Tim mentioned before, like there are lots of kind of panel data sets that are sitting out there that we can analyze, even if it's not necessarily related to specific project activities. It still tells you a lot about a particular context. And one example of this is some work we're doing with the Nigeria Living Standard Measure Surveys, LSMS, that the World Bank does, and we're looking at poverty and conflict dynamics in that context. On the composite indicators, I think Tim touched on this. They have a kind of method of doing this using principal components analysis and other means of creating composite indicators, and that will actually in part be discussed in an indicator guide that will be released I believe in July, and so you can see more about what goes into those indicators or those indices. But I think, as Tim mentioned, it's really important that we are also pulling them apart. So it's not, you know, understanding adaptive, absorptive, and transformative capacity indexes is great, but we also need to understand what's driving them kind of at a more granular level.
Thank you, Brad. And that's actually a good lead into another question that you raised, Elizabeth Dunn, about how women's empowerment and gender issues are associated with resilience measurement. So how are we including issues around gender and gender equity, household decision making into those composite indicators, but then also pulling it apart? So Tim, if you could just discuss to some extent, and we're close to time, I want to thank you all for sticking in, but Tim, if you could just briefly address this question around gender analysis with resilience. Thanks.
Yes. So one of the things about the Shahada program that CARE was implementing in Bangladesh was that they had a very big focus on women's empowerment, and they had come up with a way that they were measuring that to look at women's mobility, to look at women's decision making, and to look at women's other participation in things that were important with regards to their livelihoods. And we were able to take that composite measure and apply it in our analysis. And what we found was is that in households that had stronger women's empowerment, they were much better able to adapt to the floods than those that had lower levels of that empowerment. And I think that that's really revealing for us because we need to make sure that we continue to try to capture this. And I think somebody said this earlier, why it's so important to interview more than just one person in the household, that we need to make sure that we take into account that there are different people in the household that have different opportunities, and we need to be looking at it more comprehensively to see how women's empowerment is affecting people's decision making. And so, you know, there's been a lot of work, and Tiffany can talk to this, but there's been a lot of work on the Women's Empowerment Index that Bureau of Food Security has been working on. They've been refining it over time, and I think it's getting better. And even Karen can talk a little bit about how women's empowerment, gender issues are being incorporated more into resilience frameworks. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tim. And as I mentioned earlier, we are collecting all of these questions and input so that we can feed this into some useful follow-on activities. We had a number of questions that relate to the application of the data in programming, but also at a policy level. Do we have some examples of how resilience analysis is influencing policy and strategy? We are at time, but for those of you who can stay with us for another minute or so, I'd like to turn that over to Tiffany to respond to, and then we will close down the session. Thank you.
Thanks. So yes, as Karen mentioned, these data and this evidence that's generated by these data are being used in various forms and in various applications. So one is the programmatic side. We're trying to partner with implementing partners as much as possible to socialize these findings, to share these findings, to translate them into programmatic implications, so that this line between kind of evaluation and research gets blurred, the learning gets used. And then also on the policy implication side, so these data are constantly used to communicate with the Hill, both the Senate and the House side. They've led to a number of kind of policy changes, namely the elevation of resilience in the global food security strategy. They're being used to communicate with various stakeholders across the interagency, particularly around the increasing humanitarian needs around the world. Everyone recognizes that the current humanitarian need is unsustainable. So applying kind of resilience principles and strengthening the capacity of households and communities to manage, particularly those moderate shocks over time, will hopefully in the long term speak to reduced humanitarian need. Resilience is also being applied within USAID specifically to improving this journey to self-reliance and enhancing the abilities of countries themselves to manage their own development needs. And they've also influenced host country government policy. So one example that immediately comes to mind is Malawi, post doing a resilience analysis on existing data, the World Bank's LSMS data. We worked with the mission, conducted a resilience analysis, and now the country has a resilience policy, a resilience strategy that they'll be working to implement over the next few years. So all of that to say, some people ask, is it worth it? Is the complexity, is the nuance is it worth capturing that? Is it worth the investment?
Unfortunately, it looks like Tiffany has just dropped off.
Just a few of those examples, you come away with the answer of, yes, it is worth it. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you also, Brad and Tim, for engaging in the conversation. As always, we have more questions than we have time, but I really appreciate the way that the questions have framed our issues from some of these broader conceptual issues around the capacities and the interplay between them, time frames, thresholds, and then we were able to get into the weeds just a little bit on what some of the indicators and measures and approaches look like. So I appreciate, Tiffany, you bringing it back out again and bringing it back to the policy applications and the way that we're actually able to use some of these findings as they emerge. There is more detail in those guidance notes. Again, our time today has been limited, so we encourage you, if you haven't already, to really dive into those guidance notes. Thank you very much to the presenters. I'd like to pass the microphone to Maya for a brief wrap and some announcements about what's coming next. Thank you. I wanted to thank all of you for participating, both in this session and the previous sessions of the Real Short Course on Resilience Measurement. I want to thank our presenters for all their time and work to prepare and present at these sessions. And just to say that this culminates a great series of sessions that began with the official launch of the Guidance Notes series on April 12th. Participation has confirmed a huge interest and demand for practical support for resilience measurement. And through your questions, we've learned a lot about the challenges and opportunities we've encountered that you've encountered in conducting resilience analysis at the program level. So just a few quick comments about what's coming next. We will be sending out a survey to all of you who have participated. So please help us fill it out, give your input. That will inform our next steps. We will look carefully at your feedback, both through this survey, but also through all the questions that you've been posing and the discussions we've had throughout these 3 webinars to plan for follow-up activities, considering different ways to address all those questions that have come up. So keep your eyes out for follow-on activities through our emails and on our website. I also wanted to spread the word about 2 big events coming up in the fall. One is the RML Conference 2018, which is being organized by the Resilience Measurement Evidence and Learning Community of Practice. It will be in New Orleans on the 13th through the 15th of November, and you can submit proposals until July 30th. All information you need about it can be found at www.measuringresilience.org. On the 2nd through 4th of October, the TOPS FSN Network is organizing a regional knowledge sharing meeting, and that will take place in Bangkok. You can find all the information you need at the fsnnetwork.org. Lastly, we have some exciting publications coming up soon from the Real Award, including a series of technical briefs called Resilience in Action, which will cover a range of topics. The first one to come out is on gender equity and social inclusion. Another upcoming series of publications is the Guidance on Resilience Measurement Options produced by TANGO. Like the practical guidance notes, these resilience measurement options are designed to help you, AID staff, partners, and other stakeholders to use adaptable data collection and analysis modules to consistently capture the effects of their resilience investments. That was all I had to say. Thanks again, everyone. Never hesitate to reach out. There's a Gmail address. I'm sure you also all have my address from all the emails I've been sending out to you. So keep in touch and have a great rest of the week. Thank you. Bye.